a cartoon you saw online or something. They're still based on components of reality. They've just been stylized, or they look a little bit different, right? So we're going to focus on more realistic drawing as our foundation. How many of you have ever seen something like this before, or have ever drawn a corner sun?
Yeah.
Yeah, the corner sun, right? I mean, you think of it, it's kind of our go-to. We do it, we throw it up in the corner there, we put those beams of light coming down. And especially little kids, I think this is so funny. My daughter is sort of in this phase right now. She's 7, where she'll draw a strip of sky at the top and a strip of ground at the bottom, and they don't make that connection of a horizon line yet, right? Where our sky meets the ground. So the reason I'm showing you this is because drawing is about seeing, okay? Drawing is about seeing. However you want to think about that, you could think of it as drawing is about observing, drawing is about looking, drawing is about seeing, however that resonates with you, but that is the main goal today that we want to kind of emphasize. So we tend to draw the symbols in our minds versus what something actually looks like. This is called symbol drawing, and it's very natural to do this. If I were to ask you to each draw a cat on a piece of paper, and perhaps if you want to do this, you can, it could be a fun little exercise, but just in your mind, you draw a cat. And for some of you, it may look very basic, very symbol-like. But for some of you, if you have more drawing experience, it may look a little bit more like what a cat actually looks like. So this is something we do in our minds. This tends to happen around the time we turn 11, 12, get into that adolescence, middle school age. We start to do this a lot more than when we were kids. So thinking back to this sun, this kind of basic sun with the beams shooting out that we've all drawn before, okay, there's a place for this. It's really, really nice. It's pretty, but this is not actually what the sun looks like, right? So if you were to take a walk outside, maybe on a semi-sunny, cloudy day, maybe you'd see something like this. What do you think about this? Does this look more realistic to what the sun actually looks like? I definitely think so. I mean, we don't see the beams, so we kind of still get a sense of glow. We can kind of see the clouds with the sky versus something like this, or that little corner sun. So the art of looking. You might think that when you're just looking at something that you look at it in a similar way to when you're drawing, but that's not true at all. I'm actually posting an article on the club homepage today about this very thing, that when we look at something, let's say this mug I have, if I was going to draw this mug, I would look at it very differently than if I was going to just look at it to grab it to fill my cup of coffee. So when drawing, this is kind of my #1 tip I like to tell beginners, okay? We want to draw with shapes, not outlines of an entire object. So if you take this cat, for example, rather than tracing the outline of it, following the back leg, up around the tail, the curve of the back, up the head, rather than getting that full outline, we want to draw individual shapes. So this is why seeing and observing something, an actual object, is so important, because we train our eye to break things down into shapes, okay? And it's almost like building with Legos or building blocks. You're building it together, and eventually the outline will emerge through these series of shapes. So I did have a class on drawing 2D to 3D, which is on demand on the club page. But basically, if you can draw basic shapes and forms, then you can construct anything that you want to draw. So again, this is review if you were in my 2D and 3D class, but I just want to point out that a shape, like a square, is flat. It's two-dimensional, it has height, and it has length. That's it. okay? But if we turn it into something 3D, a cube, we add the dimension of width there, or breadth, which it says here, but width. So we have 3 components. So that helps us create a sense of depth, a sense of space. So this is important to note because drawing is flat. It's 2D on your paper. So learning how to draw a form over a shape can help you create depth, which I'm not going to go a ton into this today, but like I said, this class is on demand and you can watch this one too. But take a look at this kind of construction here of this pencil sharpener. So basically you're kind of starting with a rectangular prism or box elongated cube shape, right? So starting with that as your foundation, and then you can kind of start to construct little details and then work toward your details. So this just is showing that it's good to start simple and build it up as you go. The last thing you're doing is putting on those finishing touches, those final details. You don't want to start with those things. Also, I want to mention that using references helps us draw what we see and not what we think something looks like in our mind. Oftentimes, I think people think, oh, if I use a reference or draw from a picture, is that cheating? It's not cheating at all. It actually helps with your muscle memory. It trains your brain. It helps you learn how to draw more things. So take this lot, for example. I know it's a little blurry on the screen, but you get the gist of it. So if you have that either sitting in front of you or a picture of it that you can constantly look at, you're going to produce a more realistic drawing than if you were to just imagine a lock in your mind. So the other component we need to consider with drawing is working with value. Now, basic drawing, we're talking graphite, so it is black and white or black and gray essentially, but color also has value, okay? But lots of value or high contrast tends to make things look more realistic. So if you look at the images here of the vase with the flowers, the high key one, it's too light, right? It's all light values. There's no dark to bring out contrast. The medium key, well, it's just too gray. There's no lights, there's no darks, it's just in the middle. Low key is too dark. There's no mediums or lights to bring out the contrast to make things look like they have depth. Whereas if you look at the full value spectrum, we see lights, we see mediums, maybe like at least 3 mediums, and we see some darks. And so we get a full range of value, thus making things look more realistic. Form and value work together to help create a sense of space or depth. Again, this is an illusion we're creating. This is flat paper. There's no depth or space actually there, but we can create it with form and value together. So eventually, I know this drawing may seem intimidating when you look at it. There's a lot there, a lot of, yeah, go ahead.
We're getting feedback from somebody and it's kind of hard to concentrate on you, what you're saying.
Okay, maybe let's go ahead. Maybe if everyone wants to mute a minute and then just pop on now if you have a question. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I appreciate that. That sounds better. Yeah. So if you have a question at any time, just pop right back in and I can answer. So again, form and value working together helps create depth, helps create space. We're creating this illusion just with pencil and paper by understanding these components. So eventually you'll be able to work up to a drawing like this, but I know that seems intimidating right now. So we're going to break it down and we'll get here eventually. Again, I just want to show you another example of a drawing. You know, looking at this is very common. It's a still life objects, but this is also true if you're working with, say, a landscape or bringing it out into nature. If you look at this drawing here, I bet you could at least identify 5 values ranging from really dark to really light and maybe at least 3 to 4 in between. And again, that's key. A lot of beginner drawers are very nervous to draw really dark values. But the best tip I've ever gotten, ever, still to this day, was always push your darks darker and lighten your lights, because you'll get a really beautiful sense of contrast by doing this. The other thing, I'm just going to mention this briefly. We're not going to dive into perspective today because that's a whole other slew of lessons, which we will get to, and I will have classes on them for those of you interested. But perspective drawing helps us understand space even more, and we begin to see the world differently when we draw this way. So I'll show you in the next slide some actual examples of all these types of perspective, because if you've never seen them, you might have a hard time visualizing. But basically how it goes is 1, 2, and 3 point perspective is how we typically see life in our own perspective through our own eyes, whether we're high up, down low, it's eye level, to the side. That's typically how we view the world. Whereas a 4 point and 5 point tends to be distortion, like a mirror or a reflection in a cup, perhaps. Whereas a 6 point perspective, you're going fully round like an actual globe. So that's what this would look like. I don't have 6 point on here, but imagine just a globe is 6 point perspective. Okay, so this is, again, a lesson for a different day, but I just wanted to mention the term perspective so you have it in your mind in relation to drawing. And then, of course, we have rendering. Rendering is where we're actually applying value and mark making. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to apply marks onto our paper to get different looks. So like something like tonal or smudging is going to tend to be a little bit more realistic. The pencil lines are going to blend, they're going to go away, and you're going to have, a really rendered realistic drawing. Whereas if you do something like hatching or cross hatching, or maybe some scribbling or accent lines, or things like that, it's going to still look like a form. It'll still look 3D, but it's going to be more stylized. It's going to have more texture. Like if you look at the mug at the top here, that's been cross-hatched. So you can see how there's lines going both vertical and horizontal. And so that's how cross-hatching is done. And then you can vary pressure to get darks, mediums, and lights with your pencil, which we'll get into in just a minute. Cool. So that is the end of my slideshow. So I'm going to stop that for just a minute and go ahead and go to my document camera.
If you could go back to the slide before rendering.
Oh, with the perspective?
Yeah.
Would you like me to post that image on the club page so you have access to it? Would that be helpful?
Sure.
I mean, I'm happy to go back. Would you like to see it again now as well?
Oh, just once, real quickly. I just missed something.
Absolutely. I'm happy to share that with you. Give me just a second. Here we go. So this one here?
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Did you have a question? Oh, you want to take a picture? Perfect.
Yeah. I can't get it unless I would take a picture because, okay, thank you.
Yes, and like I said, I'm going to teach classes on all of these perspectives. I'll do different classes for each one. So if you're curious, I want to learn how to draw 1 point, I want to learn how to draw 2 point, I'll do classes on each of them so you can learn that.
Thank you. Thank you.
You are welcome. All right, perfect. Let's hop on to camera. And so just to start, and again, please hop on if you have questions. I'm going to show you what supplies I have. At the very basic, all you need is some type of paper and a pencil today. That's it. It could even be printer paper. It could even be, random scrap paper with something on the back of it. Whatever you've got today is totally fine. All I'm using, this is actually, I've labeled it for our health club, but this is from Saks. It's like a $3 sketchbook. It's pretty inexpensive. These are the ones I use in my classroom. So it's not anything fancy here. You can get really fancy drawing paper. Just so you know, you can really use graphite on any type of paper. It's just knowing what type of drawing you want to do. Something really smooth like a hot press paper is going to be really, you're going to have a lot more detail. It's going to be a lot more fine, more realistic. Whereas if you have something that's textured, like a cold pressed watercolor paper or cold pressed type paper, you're going to see more texture from the graphite. So again, one is not better than the other. It's simply a personal preference. But all paper has what's called tooth in it. So it's a little tricky to see, but if you have paper in front of you, you can even kind of look at it. And depending how much you see of that little texture, how smooth it is, will determine, you know, the style that your pencil will produce. So basic pencils, this is just a basic pencil, could be like a yellow pencil. A number 2 pencil is an HB pencil, okay? So H stands for hard and B stands for black, okay? So when you get into actual drawing pencils, which I highly recommend if you're continuing on your drawing path, they're pretty inexpensive to pick up a few. So what I have here, this is an actual HB pencil. This is Prismacolor brand, but honestly, any pencil brand is great. So HB, these are exactly the same pencil right here. Okay, this is just an actual drawing pencil. Drawing pencils, my students always ask me this, why don't they have erasers on the back of them? And I always tell them the reason why is because in the art world, there's so many types of erasers and it allows you to use whatever type you want. So other pencils I have, this is a 2B. So 2B, meaning 2 black. I have a 4B and a 6B. So they progressively will get darker. 2B is lightest, 4B is middle, 6B is darkest from what I have right here. So what I recommend is just getting yourself a couple different pencils. Have an HB, have a 2B, but you can also have H pencils. I just don't happen to have any in front of me right now. And H pencils are lighter pencils, meaning the graphite is harder. Okay, so harder graphite is going to be less smudgy, but it could risk indenting your paper, and then when you erase it, the indent stays. Whereas softer graphite, like the 4B, 6B pencils, are going to be really smudgy and soft. Okay, so it's just a matter of playing around. But for today, I'm just going to stick with a number 2 pencil. I just want to kind of show you some things you can get. You know, I do have some mechanical pencils. I don't usually like sketching in these, but sometimes they have a purpose because you can get really skinny lead for them. So sometimes that's helpful. Some other great drawing tools. These are blending stumps. You can also get ones that are a little bit shorter and look more rolled that are called tortillon. And these are all for blending, okay? And you can use them with any dry medium, but I usually keep my graphite ones separate from my charcoal ones, separate from my pastel ones, and they're reusable. So what I usually do is as they start to get dirty, I save the dirtier ones for my really dark values, and then I'll have brand new ones be my lighter values. And then just some erasers that I think are great to have when you're drawing. This is just, I usually cut them. I'll buy like big white erasers, any brand, but just a white type of eraser. Some people like the pink erasers better, but like a block eraser is good to have. This is a retractable eraser. So it's really skinny. You can also take like a razor blade and like slice it or cut it so you can get skinny little lines. So imagine like you were doing fur, and the cat is just my example, I guess, for today. But if you're drawing a fur and a cat and maybe some values were really dark, you could then use the tip of this to pull out some little highlights. So that can be really helpful. And then this is a kneaded eraser. This is, I think, an artist's, especially a drawer's, best friend. This eraser, you'll only ever need one. It's self-cleaning. It's kind of, and it's therapeutic. So it's like a, you know, a double deal here because you get to kind of, you know, knead it. And as you knead it, you'll notice it's getting lighter. That's cleaning the graphite off of it. So it's just self-cleaning by kneading it. So this is really nice because you can almost kind of use this to shade a little bit, and then you can form it. Let's say you needed like a skinny area, you can make different shapes so you have different areas to erase with. So we'll take a look at that in just a minute as well. Couple other kind of tips and tricks, things to use. Let's see if I find it. I do have an extra sheet of printer paper here. If you've ever been drawing and you notice you get tons of graphite all on your arm, I'm right-handed, so I tend to get graphite all along my arm. And on top of it, it will smudge your paper up. So my tip is I always have a secondary piece of paper, so when I'm drawing up here, I can allow my wrist and my arm to rest here, and I'm not gonna smudge. So that's a little tip I found, because especially beginning drawers, they tend to just smudge a lot when they're drawing because they're new and they're learning the material, and that gets frustrating. And then lastly, before we start drawing, tissues are awesome because you can use them to blend, and you can wrap them around your finger, you can just kind of bunch them up. But perhaps if you've ever attempted to shade something, I can even just show you, but if you shade something and blend with your finger, it might look good for a little bit, but what happens is our hands have so many oils in them, and the oils transfer to the paper and the graphite, and it doesn't look so good after a while. It gets smudgy, it's not consistent. So resist the urge to kind of blend with your finger. And again, most people have some kind of tissue in their home. This is really nice because then I can get a really soft blend and it's consistent and even. Okay, so those are a couple things, tools and things that are helpful. So the next thing I want to talk about is holding the pencil, okay? So typically when we've used pencils, we've been trained to write, right? Through school or work, we're typically writing. And writing has a lot of action in our wrist, right? There's no need to really move any more than that. So if you're just writing, like I can just write my name, right? Again, I don't need any movement for that. It's just in my wrist. So when we come to draw, we tend to repeat that same muscle memory that we're using when we're writing letters, and we just want to draw with our wrist. And we're limiting ourselves a lot when we do that. Really, we want to think about all our movement points from your wrist to your elbow to your shoulder. Your shoulder is so important when you're drawing. So really, don't be afraid to give yourself some space. So rather than, and you can even just try this, if you have some pencil and paper right in front of you, try this. Try drawing a circle. Let's draw a circle. Try drawing a circle just using your wrist, okay? And I know I kind of got off topic. I was going to talk about the pencil hold too, but I'm talking a little bit about movement first, and then we'll get to the pencil hold. So in what I'm doing here, this is called the tripod hold. I'll just tell you that right now. So I have 3 fingers on it, and notice I'm not up to the tip of my pencil. It's back a little bit, okay? So first thing, try to do this. Do a tripod hold, move it back a little bit, and try drawing a circle just moving your wrist. Okay, so I will say I've drawn a lot of circles, so mine might look more circular than yours, depending. Sometimes I have students that are like, how does yours look like a circle? Mine looks like an egg. And, you know, don't worry about that. So I have a lot more muscle memory too, depending on where your drawing skills are at. So that was just with my wrist. Now try opening up your arm a little bit. Try activating your shoulder a little bit, and try just bringing your arm back a little bit. I know you can't see my shoulder, so it depends how much you can see me in the video. But as I move back, and I'm not just tightly drawing anymore, but I'm allowing my arm to really move and create that shape. So now try to move, okay? And you can even, if you want, you can do some loose sketches like this, if this is helpful for you, because sometimes it's a little scary at first. Okay, so you could do some little sketches like this, or you can allow yourself to kind of overlap them a little bit too. So just know as you're starting to begin moving your arm in different ways, this is going to get better, okay? But it's okay to let it go around a few times versus just one time. That'll help you get more of the circle. And same thing with your wrist, but just kind of practice really loosening up your arm and really using that full range of motion as you're drawing. And then kind of going back to the holds here. So if you're doing the tripod hold, okay, which this is typically how I like to hold a pencil, this is really good for little detail work, little strokes. So, you know, maybe I'm just kind of flicking my wrist. Maybe you could try this too. Just kind of little short lines, you know, or maybe some little straight vertical lines, which something I find helpful for getting straight lines is going from top to bottom versus bottom to top. So just allowing it to go down, and the more lines you draw, they're going to get better. Sometimes it seems silly just repeating lines or drawing lines, but it really does help you improve. So kind of playing around with that motion with your wrist versus your full shoulder using that tripod hold. So the other way to hold a pencil is going to be from the top. Okay, so you're going to kind of grip it. You can take your pointer finger and your thumb and kind of place it on top, and then let the rest of your hand just kind of wrap around. Okay, so I'll hold it like this. You can see it from different ways. This kind of feels weird at first when you're first doing it, but this is, there's a couple different ways you can kind of activate your wrist this way, because you can kind of, this allows you to naturally use more of your shoulder as you're drawing, and you can also get more of the side and edge of your pencil. Which, another thing I'll mention is some artists like to have one pencil that they actually sharpen with a knife so that more graphite is exposed. There's a longer tip. And then they'll have one pencil that they will use like a traditional sharpener for. So I don't happen to have a knife on me right now to sharpen it that way, but just keep in mind, if you have more of the pencil, the lead exposed, you're able to create more of a background. Okay, so I'll just kind of show you this a minute, and then I'll also show you at the same time these erasers. So this kneaded eraser, see, I can just kind of, I don't have to erase everything. It's almost a way I can sort of lighten things or blend things without removing it completely. And then again, as this builds up with graphite, I can just clean it. Okay, so this can be a tool for shading as well as erasing. Whereas again, this little guy, I can get some of those little skinny lines, and if I cut this and got a skinnier tip, I could even get smaller lines. Okay, so sometimes when you're drawing, it's also a subtractive method, not always additive. So keep in mind, an eraser isn't just to get rid of mistakes, but sometimes you need the eraser to draw in essentially your highlights. So in a sense, eraser is a very important drawing tool. So we've kind of covered some pencil holds, some pencil control. The other thing I'll mention is when you are holding your pencil like this, you can always tip your wrist a little bit forward too to get some different types of lines. But this is where kind of the fun part comes in, because you can create all sorts of different lines as you start to play with moving your pencil around in different ways within that hold. And why is that important? Why do you need to know about this type of line making? It's because when you're trying to create textures in graphite, it's going to come in handy. For example, you might say, oh, this looks like fur on an animal, right? Whereas maybe I could build up, go back to my tripod hold, I could build up little strokes like this, and it starts to look like grass or something like that. So building up texture is an important thing. So the next thing I want to show you too is let's practice making a little value scale a minute. So we're just going to do 5 values to keep it super simple. So all I'm going to do is just draw myself a little rectangle like this. Okay, and then say I'll have my white, gray number 1, gray number 2, gray number 3, and dark. Actually, I'm going to erase this little end off. So I'm going to label this at the top. Okay, so this is going to be number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. So I think 5 values is a good place to start in the beginning when you're drawing. So what you want to try to work on is going from light to dark. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit on this so you can see it a little bit better, make it easier. So with white, and if you want, you could even draw a box here and have this be 0, meaning this is just the white of my paper. I'll just label that so you can keep that in mind. So if you want to have one that's just white, totally white, you can. So then what you'll do is just try going in one consistent direction. So I'm just going up and down, up and down. You could also go back and forth, back and forth. But what you're going to do is you're going to try to, just with the pressure of your pencil, and you don't have to worry about staying in your lines too much. That's just kind of something helpful. But go ahead and try to, just with your one pencil, see if you can get at least 5 different values. Now, when you go back, if you're like, oh, this one could be maybe a little bit lighter, or maybe this needs to be a little bit darker. So what you want to do is actually be able to tell the difference between them. So like maybe this one could be a little bit lighter. So it's okay to have to go back and refine it. It's totally fine to do. I can darken this one up. But then what you're going to notice is how this is, if I kind of turn my paper, you see a sheen on it, right? It's kind of shiny. That's because all the paper fibers basically have been pushed down because I pressed really hard to get that really dark value. So keep that in mind too. When you're shading really lightly, you're just grazing the top of the paper. As you add pressure, you're starting to push down the fibers. So what does that mean? That means I can't add anything more to this once it's shiny. That's as dark as it's getting. There's nothing more I can really do to this with this HB pencil. Now, if I brought in my 2B pencil, I'll just go next to this so you can see. With my 2B pencil, it might be a little tricky to see in my camera, but I can see it with my own eye. This is darker than this. Okay, so that's why having some of the extra pencils comes in handy when you're starting to work with value. So the next thing I just want to show you quickly, and then we'll draw a little something together, is just some of the different ways you can render. Oops. Sorry about that. There we go. Sorry about that. My daughter actually just tried to call me, so my camera kind of okay, there we go. Okay, so let's take a look at some different methods of shading. So what I'm going to do here is just do, I'm actually going to sharpen my pencil a minute. These are just some different methods and ways that you can shade with graphite. And they're also applicable for charcoal, for colored pencil, for many of the other drawing mediums as well. But we'll just kind of specifically take a look at graphite today. So we can, of course, blend. Okay, so in blending, again, this is where that top hold is going to really come in handy if you're wanting to blend lots or big areas. So I can just shade on the side like this. And again, I could use like my Kleenex, my tissue, to blend. Now, one thing to keep in mind with graphite is I can build up layers. So if I want this to become darker on top of that initial blend, I can add more, and then I can continue to blend it. Now, as I do these layers and continue to build up those blends, it's going to be darker and have a lot more value there and be a lot more smoother, rather than if I burnish initially, which again, burnish could be, I have a layer like this, and then I shade really, really heavy on top. So I've got that shiny finish again. That's what burnishing means. It's that shiny finish. It's basically all your paper fibers have been smashed down. You can't put anything else on top of it, okay? So there is a time and place where you do want to burnish because you do want those really dark, saturated values to show up. So sometimes burnishing is really important. Scumbling, this is the technique I use the most, and actually when I'm shading, this is mostly what I'm doing. So this is kind of activating your wrist a little bit more, but you're basically doing little movements like this. So I'm not going back and forth or up and down or side to side, but little circles. Now you can tilt your pencil a little bit. You can also do this with the top hold. Okay, so a top hold is going to look a lot different than my tripod hold. Okay, so this I'm kind of using more of the edge of the pencil, and I'm just going little circles and letting them layer on top. And I can play with pressure, so more pressure is going to, of course, appear darker, whereas light pressure will appear lighter. Okay, so we can use pressure here too. But if I scumble using the tripod hold, okay, it's going to look a little bit different because I'm using more of the tip of my pencil. And then of course, if I use a dull pencil, I'll get a different result than if my pencil is very sharp. So keep that in mind too. Sometimes you want a dull pencil, sometimes you want a sharp pencil. It just really depends on what you're trying to do. The other thing I'll mention is if your pencil is really sharp, you might dent your paper more. Okay, so if I shade like that and then shade like this and try to erase them and try to shade on top, it's a little tricky to see in the camera. You might have to try this with your own so you can see it with your naked eye, but I can still see the indentation from where I drew there. Again, it's a little tricky to see. I'll see if I can do this one. So once that paper's been indented, you can't bring that back again. Again, it's right, the dent is right here. Okay, so keep that in mind with your lead and how you're pressing into the paper, because it does factor into it. So I did kind of talk about this already, but it is a graphite technique. So if you're kind of labeling these, it's helpful to have it all together. But if you've got, you know, like a section, like I said, erasing is also a graphite technique. And this could even just be with the eraser you have in your pencil. You could even scumble with that eraser. Okay, and I almost could maybe create some kind of cloud effects or something like that. So keep in mind, like I said, an eraser is an important part of your graphite and kind of drawing toolkit. So hatching, I mentioned this briefly, and we can kind of do hatching and cross hatching together. They go together. But hatching is a great way for beginners to shade, I think. And the reason why is because it helps you focus on the drawing and seeing where value goes without having to worry about it being rendered so perfectly. So I think hatching and cross hatching is a great place to start. So hatching is just simply lines basically parallel to each other. Okay, and there's a couple things you can do to change what those lines look like. For example, you could space them out. or you could have them really, really close together, or you could do really, really light pressure, or you could have really heavy pressure. So it just kind of, you know, depends what look you're trying to achieve. And that's why kind of just taking some time with pencil and paper and playing around with these different techniques and marks helps you feel more comfortable when you're starting to draw actual objects. So cross hatching, so we'll start with hatching, but then cross hatching just adds the element of the other line. Almost think like, you know, kind of that plaid kind of pattern. And again, you can layer them really close together with heavy pressure to create dark values. You could also go at a diagonal if you wanted to. So cross hatching for me, I like it because it's quick, it's easy, it's a way to put value on there, but you can also blend with cross hatching. So I'll just kind of scooch this up a little bit. I think that'll help. So if you want to achieve a beautiful blend just with cross hatching, the key is you need 5 layers at least, and you want them to go in all directions. So if you start going down like this, and then going across, and then diagonal this way, and diagonal this way, and then maybe one more pass down the middle. What you've got in that middle is very blended. So what that tells us is building up layers creates blending without even needing to use like a tissue or a blending stump. You can simply blend just with your pencil by allowing those layers to build up over top of each other. And you'll create, again, in the middle of this is that most blended part where they actually overlap. So another thing that can be very, very helpful in seeing, and this might be good like if you have a plant in your home or, you know, anything, you could even make this up, but a negative drawing. So what I mean by a negative drawing is you could have, we'll just give it a little frame, okay? So within here, what a negative drawing would be practicing drawing just shapes of things. So perhaps, you know, I'm going to draw some little kind of leaf shapes. Maybe it's going off the page a little bit. So this can be just, again, these don't have to be forms. This is more simplistic, but this just helps you practice shape. But then what you can do is just shade in the background. It's like a positive, negative kind of a thing. But again, it helps you understand space because space in relationship to drawing is very important. So you get the idea. You could shade that whole thing, but that's what a negative drawing would be. And you could do the opposite where you shade the plant and then let the background be white, or you could try bringing colors into it. But this is a nice way to just practice very simple kind of shapes and drawing things too. So a couple more techniques and then we'll draw a little something together, or we'll start drawing a little something together before we're done. So there's scribble, and then we have stippling as well. Those are our last 2. Okay, so scribbling, this is, I think, you know, tripod hold is good or top hold, but you're really wanting to activate your elbow here, or sorry, your shoulder here, elbow and wrist. But it's just allowing yourself to just kind of move the lines all over the place. And if you go online and, you know, hop on Google and search for scribble portraits or scribble art, people can produce very beautiful results just by scribbling. And again, the idea is the same as, let's say, this negative drawing. You still have a shape or a form. You're just bringing around edges or value to help create depth or space. So for scribbling, where I space it out, it's going to be a light value. But if I scribble really close together, or allow my scribbles to begin layering, I've then started to create value, right? And more depth. So in fact, like that little initial value scale we did on going from light to dark, you could do a value scale with all these techniques pretty much. You could do one with scribbling, you could do one with cross hatching, you could blend one, and it's a great way to just practice getting used to the different pressures of your pencil and the lights and the darks. And then the last one is stippling. Stippling is very time consuming, but it produces gorgeous, beautiful results. And I think it's very beginner friendly actually, but stippling is just a series of little dots. In fact, lots of people will do these with pens instead of pencils, but it's just layering dots. The more dots you have together, the darker the value appears. Whereas if you space out your dots more, you're going to have an open value. So same kind of idea with all of these techniques. So these are just different methods for kind of rendering what you're choosing to draw. So we've got a little bit of time left, and please know that drawing is a huge topic. I took multiple classes just on basic drawing in art school when I went to become an art teacher, and it single-handedly improved my art, my painting, my printmaking, just everything. But please know this is just the beginning, and I want to continue to support you as you're learning to draw and continue to give you advice and tips. But what I put together was kind of what I thought was like foundational information, so you felt ready to get started. So we do have a little bit of time left today, so we might not finish this completely. I don't want to zoom in too close. Let's see. There we go. But what we're going to do is we're going to draw a cylinder together. And the reason I'm picking a cylinder is because cylinders, we see them everywhere. My mug is basically a cylinder, right? My pencil sharpener is a cylinder. My tree trunks are made up out of cylinders. A cylinder is a very basic form, and once you feel good about drawing it, you can draw lots of different things, okay? So what you're gonna do to start is you're going to draw a circle, or an oval, I should say, or an ellipse, okay? And how open this is determines how much of the top you are going to see. Okay, so less of the top would be really skinny like this. This is where perspective comes into play. Whereas if I'm seeing more of the top, it'll be like this. Okay, so you can kind of decide how much of the top of this do you want to see. And it's okay once you have something on here. There we go. Sorry about that. Once you have something on here, if it's not quite where you want it to be, you can change it. That's okay. Take your time when you're beginning with these forms. Don't worry if your lines look heavy or don't look perfect. That's not our goal yet, okay? We're just starting very basic. We just want to draw a form. So I've got the top, and then I can just start to bring down my two sides. So imagine like a can of soup, something very basic. But again, drawing is basic at the very beginning. It's just what we do to this and how we build it that starts to transform it and makes it more complex. So the key to the bottom here is I want this line to match this line. Okay, so you want to see those parallel. And I'll just kind of show you over here. You know, you could even have like a shorter one, but again, the key is I want to make, go this way. It just needs to match. Okay. So that's the key with the cylinder. And then after you've done a cylinder, you could do anything. So my thought is, let's turn this into like a cork, the top of a cork for a bottle. Okay, that's simple. It's a cylinder. I think we could all imagine in our mind roughly what that looks like. So I'm going to walk you through how to kind of draw that just quickly. And we might not quite finish it today, but that's okay. It'll just kind of give us a sense of how to approach something. So what I'll do is I'm just going to add a little shading just with some hatching lines on the right hand side of this. So I'm imagining the light was coming from this direction, okay? Just for your reference. And your method of observation here is drawing from my reference. Okay, so I'm just kind of bringing out some hatch lines just so it kind of goes out a little bit. It's not perfectly straight up and down, okay? Because a lot of times shadows kind of work with the form itself. Now here I could take a little tissue, or I could take one of my blending stumps. I could soften this a little bit right here if I wanted to. You don't have to, but you could. Just depends how much texture you want to see. You know, that's kind of your opinion, whatever you want. Grab a different pencil too. So after you've kind of started to do something like this, think about texture of a cork. So what we want to do is translate texture or surface quality onto this basic form so we can actually turn it into something. Okay, so if you think about a cork, what it's made out of, and kind of all those little grooves, here you can kind of be a little bit free and loose. You know, maybe you're drawing some little shapes and then just filling them in. Okay, and then I could start to kind of do more of those. Maybe some are a little darker than others because the indentations are deeper in some areas of the cork than others. I could also kind of start to put some lines in here, maybe a little bit. But now what I'm doing is I'm starting to kind of build up this texture. And this could be anything you're wanting to draw. You know, maybe there's some lines kind of coming this way a little bit. And of course, if I had an actual cork in front of me, I could, you know, actually look at what it looks like and look at all the details. I also, for example, have an apple. Okay, so if you were wanting to think about like drawing an apple, okay, this would roughly start with a sphere, but that apple's not a perfect sphere. So this is maybe how I would try to break this down. So I'll just kind of leave you with this too, so you can kind of see an observation. Because this cork, if I just keep building up these textures, eventually that'll start looking like a cork. But if I want to draw something like this apple, and keep in mind your perspective on my camera is a little bit different than my viewpoint, so it might not look exactly like what you're seeing. But what I usually start doing is I'll just kind of start breaking down the shape. I'm using my eyes to kind of follow the curve of the apple. And then I'll naturally start to break things up into separate shapes. So I've been drawing a long time, so I naturally just sort of do this. This is something you'll have to intentionally do though, because like I said, our mind doesn't always want to do that. So, okay, there's my basic apple shape. And again, for me here, that's about kind of where my viewpoint was, so you can kind of see that. So maybe I'll see a little bit more back here. So I basically have three little shapes here. The big shape, and then I've got a shape here and a shape here for the top of the apple. So now that I have a basic shape down, and it's loose, it's rough, it's going to need to be refined, but keep in mind as I start shading it, it will become refined. So now what I do is I look at the surface quality of the object, much like I did when I was going to start this cork. And this apple has lots of reds, it has lighter yellow areas, and there's lots of texture in this particular apple. So I'm going to start breaking it down into shapes. So I see a big shape right here. So I'm going to tilt it a little bit more so it's my perspective again. But maybe I'm going to start by just drawing that in as a shape here. I also see a little shape up here I could put in. Some of this sort of translates into a loose organic shape. I could then put in. But then from here, I can start rendering and adding value. But you know, it's important to not get too ahead of yourself in what you feel comfortable with, I would say. So what I would leave you with, because I know I've given you a lot of information, and like I said, I will have more drawing classes building on what I've introduced today, as well as new topics. But what I'd say is start by picking an object in your home and trying to draw something like this. So you're seeing some different shapes. And then when you look at the object, I moved my apple, but when you look at that object, you can identify, okay, this is this. This is this. This kind of loose shape is this shape. And as you start doing just this without any value whatsoever, you will automatically start improving. Okay, so that's kind of a good way to start, just simple little objects, breaking them down from forms. So like a cork from a cylinder, an apple from a sphere, whatever you can come up with, but try to relate them back to those basic forms. So